Welcome to Bittersweet Science. I'm Jim Mellen, and I hope you enjoy boxing with me. Today's topic, topic 2, is mixed martial arts, MMA. Let me start out by saying that I've told my boxers for about the last 30 years that the two most efficient fighting styles, modes, in a street fight or in a no-holds-barred bout are boxing and wrestling. Boxing first because the fight starts on the feet usually, and then if the boxing isn't sufficient enough, it goes to the ground for wrestling. Fast forward ahead to this year, 2011, and watch any MMA bout, and you will see that the first two modes that the MMA fighters go into are boxing and wrestling. Boxing is not a martial art. Wrestling is not a martial art. The third mode that the fights usually go into, if it's on the ground, is street fighting. Street fighting is not a martial art either. The fourth mode, if it gets past the street fighting mode, is jiu-jitsu, which is a martial art, but it's the only effective martial art used in MMA fighting. Traditional martial arts with the knife hands, the ridge hands, the circular blocks, the high kicks, they're all worthless in a real fight. In point fighting, yeah, plain tag, possibly, but not in a real fight. So, if you watch any kicks, you'll see that they're low kicks, or if you see any knees, they're knees that are not from any particular style. They're more of like a street fighting mode that you don't have to practice for any length of time to be sufficient at. But it's definitely street fighting. The only martial art that is used efficiently in MMA is jiu-jitsu. I call this sport boxing, wrestling, and street fighting, BWS. Now, I could see right off the bat that the name of this sport was ridiculous. Others have talked to me in the last few years and have asked me, why do they call it mixed martial arts when there's practically no martial arts in there? Well, it's because of the fact that boxing, wrestling, and martial arts have always been in competition with each other. Boxing and wrestling were in competition with each other for years until they realized that they needed each other, that they were the two most effective fighting styles. You're either on your feet or you're on the ground, the mat, whatever. And they're the simplest to do and the most effective to do. MMA fighting is, of course, boxing, wrestling, street fighting, and jiu-jitsu, like I said. But it's called martial arts, mixed martial arts, because they're in competition with boxing and wrestling. They don't want to give boxing credit. They don't want to give wrestling credit. Boxing, wrestling, and martial arts are all in competition with each other, basically. But it's for recruiting students, it's for promoting the sport, and it's for bragging rights. But make no mistake about it, it's boxing, wrestling, and street fighting, or you could call it boxing, jiu-jitsu, and street fighting. I think you have to leave street fighting in there because that's definitely used more often than martial arts. If you're going to call it mixed martial arts, you might as well call it mixed sports and include basketball or volleyball in there because they're used as often as traditional martial arts are. In other words, never. If you want to keep it with three terms, you could go boxing, wrestling, and street fighting because I believe that jiu-jitsu is just the closing aspect of wrestling, but you could say boxing, jiu-jitsu, and street fighting. Having covered that, I want to go on to the ridiculous matchup between James Toney and Randy Couture. James Toney did not embarrass boxing, he just embarrassed himself. First off, I wouldn't put James Toney in my list of the top 200 boxers of all time. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't even make my list of 100 best contemporary fighters. He never had a good work ethic. He, was undisciplined. He came into his bouts in his earlier years, 1 or 2 weight divisions, overweight. He was soft, he was smooth, he was slow, flat-footed, had slow hands, slow feet, had a thug mindset. And of course, if you watch the Roy Jones Jr. James Toney fight, you'll see that Roy Jones Jr. made James Toney look like a little kid. And he never was the fighter that a lot of people thought he was. If you watch his later fights, where he just hangs on the ropes and beats fighters that are over the hill or who were never on the hill, you'll see that he won those fights by just outpointing his opponents on the rope with a very lazy mode of fighting, which was okay because of who he was fighting. You can't fight a BWS fighter that way, a UFC fighter, MMA fighter, whatever you want to say, because you have to be more aggressive. James Toney was, of course, out of shape like he always was in his career, fat and slow, no footwork, and he didn't get off first. He didn't even throw one punch, and of course Randy Couture took him down and beat him easily. But James Toney did not embarrass boxing, he embarrassed himself. Along those lines, I would like to suggest that those MMA people who think that their boxing skills are so good, to step up and challenge somebody in professional boxing in whatever weight class they're in. Anybody in the top 100, I don't care if it's the 100th or 99th opponent, just to see how well they do against a boxer, a real boxer, a professional boxer. Now, they're always talking about how good their boxing is. The first thing they come out and do is box, and then they wrestle, of course, like I said. Obviously, their boxing is horrible, but that's the first mode they go into. But they think their boxing is great. I think their ground game is great. But their boxing, to me, is horrible. And I suggest, if they think it's so good, they should go into professional boxing, unless they'd rather remain a big fish in a small bowl, which a lot of people like to do, or, they just don't want to make 50 times the amount of money in professional boxing that they would make in mixed martial arts. Now, in mixed martial arts, they could remain, very popular, but I believe they know that their boxing skills aren't good enough to compete in just boxing on the professional level. If they were, they could make a fortune. So they either don't want to go up and take on a boxer because, like I say, they want to remain comfortable in a sport that they can do well in, rather than make 50 times the amount of money. Some people don't want to make that kind of money. I'm not being sarcastic, and I admire those people. They'd rather do their thing rather than, just do something to make a lot of money and then, of course, look ridiculous. But that's up to them, and that's not human nature that people would turn down that kind of money if they thought they could succeed. That's the way I see it. You can take it or leave it. I'm Jim Mellen, and I hope you enjoyed boxing with me.